Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast giving America hope since 2018. I'm Ryan Coonerty. Along with Debbie Cox Bultan of the New Deal, I'm lucky enough to be your co-host. An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. The New Deal is an organization that supports the next generation of American leaders. From attorneys generals to state senators to mayors to school board members, these are the people that are pushing policies and politics that will respond to climate change, rebuild our economy, address racial injustice, and restore our democracy. These are incredibly talented people who have dedicated themselves to public service when their country and their communities needed it the most. Check out newdealleaders.org to see what I'm talking about.
Today I talk with Third Way's Senior Vice President for Social Policy, Education, and Politics, Lanae Erickson. Third Way's out this week with a post-election poll about what happened, from the presidential to down-ballot races. Lanae shares some of the top takeaways from the poll, including that on the issues that mattered most to voters this cycle, the economy, immigration, safety, voters trusted Donald Trump more. And that disturbingly, voters thought that Democrats were the more extreme party. We talk about where we go from here, what lessons can be learned from the U.S. and Senate House candidates, including New Dealers who outperformed the top of the ticket, as well as the impact of identity politics and what the path back to the majority looks like for Democrats. I hope you enjoy. All right, Lanae Erickson, welcome to An Honorable Profession.
Thanks so much for having me.
I am excited to talk to you as always. Always love hearing your perspective. You guys have a new poll out that we're going to talk about. I wish we were gathering. I wish we were talking on a week where we had better news to share. So let's just brace our listeners for that. But I think that it's super important that we dive in and really understand what happened. It's a real time, I think, for Democrats to reflect and to listen and to get honest about what happened and where we go from here. So to have you help us make sense of it, we are grateful to have you on to do that. So with that, tell us a little bit about this poll you just released and some of the top takeaways.
Absolutely. I think we're all trying to dig through whatever data we can find at this point, knowing that we want to know the answers and find conclusions in real time, but all of the voter file data isn't going to be available for 6 months or longer. So we're grasping to whatever we can find to give Democrats a sense of where we need to move going forward. And I do think that what we have seen in this poll and in the election data all told does give us some hope. There are a lot of Democrats that did win really tough races, including a lot of your folks in the New Deal who are incredible leaders. But we obviously have some grappling to do with some places that we lost, including the top of the ticket where we lost in a pretty striking way that was really tough to handle. So I think if you look across this poll, what you see, we polled 1,600 voters in battleground states, presidential battleground states, many of which also had Senate races this year. And we didn't oversample of Latino voters because we knew going into it that was going to be a population folks were talking a lot about. And that bigger sample gave us an ability to dig a little bit underneath to look at things like college education, especially among white voters, to look at specific age populations, to look at folks that decided later in the game, because we really want to understand not just the overall picture of where we stand, but where we stand with these different voter groups that could have, put us in a different direction, but ultimately ended up almost all moving in a Trump direction. So really the takeaway here, I think, is that, Harris had a lot of weight that she had to contend with. There were a lot of things that the vice president, as she entered a 100-day sprint for a general election, that she had to carry, including the kind of Biden baggage of people being frustrated about the economy and inflation, of people being perhaps frustrated about other stances that the Biden White House had taken, and including the border, and also about, the Democratic brand writ large being seen as further to the left than where most voters were. So if you look through kind of the top lines of the poll, what you see to start is that voters said they trusted Trump more on pretty much every single issue that they prioritized. So if you look at border security, they trusted Trump by 21 points. On crime, they trusted him by 11 points. On the economy, by 9. On cost of living, by 8. And we were even tied on the issue of democracy, which seems insane.
Yeah, you see my eyes just flow out of my head here. But yes, I hear you.
But that's where we are. And so when you looked at what voters trusted Harris more on, it was abortion, only by 8 points, and climate change by 10. Now, when you add all of those together and you look at what voters are prioritizing, it's almost incomprehensible that we would have expected Harris to win in that environment. When voters are saying the economy, cost of living, and immigration are their top issues, and they trust Trump more on all of those things by, double digits or more, it's really, really hard to overcome that. And I think a lot of us thought, yes, but it's Trump. He's insane, he's terrible, he's racist, and so he won't be an option. So even with this backdrop of trust and lack of trust in Democrats that Harris had to carry, she'd be able to overcome that. But that just frankly didn't pan out that way. And I think there were two questions that really, really stuck with me when you kind of added up all of those policy conversations together. One was, do you think that Harris was a change or more of the same? 39% said it was a change. 60% said more of the same. I mean, that's deadly when you're talking about, an American electorate that a supermajority says we're going in the wrong direction. That is just really hard to contend with. And then the other is we asked why people voted for Trump or Harris. Was it because they agreed with them on the issues? Was it because they thought they had good character? Was it because they disliked the other candidate, or because they didn't want the other person's party to be in charge? For Trump, 80% said they voted for him because of the policies. And for Harris, only 41% said they voted for her because of the policies. Another chunk said character. A smaller chunk said it was because they disliked Trump or they didn't want Republicans in charge. But that's a real indictment of where people think that Democrats and the Democratic Party brand is on some of these issues and our ability to handle particularly economic issues and issues around safety. Order at the border and crime and safety in your community. And I think in order to really be able to grapple with that moving forward, we're going to have to figure out, how we can show voters that we can be trusted on those issues, that we care about them, and we will act to keep them safe and to be good stewards of the economy. And hopefully we can look at some of the more down ballot folks that were able to win, both some of the New Deal leaders and perhaps some of the Senate candidates that outperformed in these states, to get a little bit of a pathway forward.
Yeah. Can I first of all, I just want to say that's super interesting. I so appreciate you sharing that. And, we also released a little bit of a report this week talking to New Deal leaders around the country in states about kind of what they saw just in their own words, not a poll, but just, to get their perspective. And I just want to say that it really dovetails very much with what you're saying. The first thing our leaders around the country and states all over the country said was that we just didn't people didn't feel like we were connected with them particularly on the high cost of living. And that at the end of the day, that was just too important. And then also secondarily talked about things like immigration being an albatross and some of these other points that you're making. So just, what we're hearing also really concurs with your findings. And I think that another thing that came up in our conversations, to your point about why you voted for someone, was a kind of a feeling that what we were running on largely was that we're not Trump, right? And I'm not really blaming the vice president for this. Actually, I think to your point, this Democratic Party brand thing is decades in the making. Like, actually, this is.
That's right.
I hope as we're having this conversation, I don't think anybody should really be pointing blame at her or she ran a great campaign in 100 days. But I think that, some of those things we had to overcome about, what Democrats stand for, not just what we're against, came through in the conversations we were having. So it's interesting that to your point too, like people weren't buying that, right? They weren't saying, I'm just going to vote against Trump. I want to know what you stand for. That's what I hear you saying.
Absolutely. And, to that point, I do think, another section of our poll tested the Harris messages that she really embraced over the past 100 days and asked voters whether they liked that better or whether they liked a further left version of the Democratic Party. Because we knew, we fielded this poll post-election. It was in just the days right after. And we knew that there was going to be a reckoning within the Democratic Party. Obviously, all of us are deeply disappointed that we have to contend with a second Trump term, and that there were going to be some that said, Harris made a mistake by playing to the middle, and that if she had gone further left, then she would have actually won. And what we saw, we tested every single issue where there's kind of a divergence between the center left and how we talk about the issues and the further left. And what we saw was across every single issue, from crime to immigration to the economy to climate to transgender issues, the center left version of what Harris was talking about, order at the border and an opportunity economy, they tested 20 and 30 points better than the far left position. So I think there's very little evidence to show that that going towards the middle hurt her. And in fact, I think she would have done much worse if she had leaned into a further left message. But she had a very short period of time. And when you have a Democratic brand that has been so baked and, marinating in these ideas, even if they don't represent the plurality of our electeds, they represent the loudest voices on social media, the loudest voices on cable, the quotes that obviously Trump and his allies took for attack ads. That kind of farther left caricature of the Democratic Party does far worse with voters than what Harris had on offer, which was a more center left view. So if she had had longer, if she hadn't taken different positions in 2019 that she then had to contend with, if she felt that she distanced herself from the Biden administration's positions, say by saying we should have done what we did on immigration 2 years earlier, I think we'd be in a different place. And that gives me a little bit of hope in a really tough time, because I don't think that we have a lack of ideas. I think we know, not on all of these issues, obviously we need to revisit some of these things and learn every single election cycle. But we have a playbook on immigration. We know what we should be doing to restore order at the border. And those things actually tested far and away above where Harris was in the candidate choice. So I think in some of those places, leaning into those positions was probably what got these Senate candidates like Gallego and Slotkin and others over the hump. They were out there 2 years before Harris was, with order at the border ads and, leaning into these messages of safety and economic opportunity. And so they were able to kind of distance themselves from this caricatured Democratic brand. And she just didn't have enough time to really land that.
Yeah, I agree. Back to, again, kind of heard similar things from our leaders. We talked to a couple of the campaigns that did well in the House, U.S. House. So, for example, Kristen McDonald-Rivet, who was in a very key district in Michigan. We talked to her campaign manager, who said that essentially exactly what you just said, basically that because people know her, because she had spent so much time in the community, they had relationships with her, they knew that she was really all about the economy, she was all about order and security, and that it made that, to use your word, I think that's right, that caricature or any disinformation so much harder to stick on someone when people are like, yeah, but I know her. I hear what you're saying about, Democrats or whatever, but I know her. That's not right. And so I know this is maybe a little bit outside the purview of your poll. So, but I just wonder, I don't think it's good for Democrats, frankly, that all the successful Democrats have to feel like they have to almost run against the national brand. Like, that's not a great place to start. So I guess I'm just wondering, it sounds like you heard the same thing, but it feels to me like the task ahead of us is to remake the image of the Democratic Party in that image of those folks who are winning, which, to your point, is actually, in my view, the vast majority of Democratic elected officials. Actually, the caricature that is painted and portrayed nationally is actually not, not really, the reality for the folks that we work with at New Deal every day, for example. So, but yeah, anything else you can tell us again about anything else you've found with those Senate candidates running ahead that is instructive for folks?
Yeah, I think that this is always the tension. And you mentioned we've struggled with the brand for a while. We've had moments where we've been able to overcome it, both in down ballot races. And I think, frankly, in 2020, largely due to COVID, the economy, people still trusted Trump in 2020 over Biden on the economy. They just listed COVID as a bigger priority than the economy at that point. So we won despite having that deficit on the economy in terms of trust. And, thank God we did. And we got ourselves and President Biden got us and his administration out of that emergency situation and in a much better place now. But then that lagging trust deficit on the economy is, continues to haunt us. And I think you're so right about the brand. Like, to some extent, local and statewide candidates, any candidates, are going to want to have their own distinct brand. But I just think about trying to make it less of an anvil that they have to carry around, right? If we could have folks need to outperform the Democratic brand by 2 points or 4 points in some of these places and not 18 points or 20 points, that would be huge progress. And given the structures of some of our electoral systems, we still would have to outperform with moderates and the center, but it would set folks up to do that so much better. And so that's really, kind of, I think, our task moving forward. And it's hard, right? Because the way that media works now, the loudest voices get the most airtime. And that's always been true, but even more so now. It's much easier to go viral if you say something extreme. But I often say to folks, we can't stop people from saying stupid things. Someone somewhere is going to say something that is deeply unpopular and probably a very bad policy idea who has a D by their name. But what we can do is be louder ourselves. We have to speak more, not try to get other people to speak less. And we have to speak courageously about what we see and the truth, even if that might sometimes get us some hate from the Twitterati or others who have kind of a very ideological views. Because if all voters are hearing is those more extreme views, then they're going to think that's the only way that it's possible to be a Democrat. We know that's not true, but we really need to be out there more, and that's something we can both do, and it feels like a good action step in this moment, right? To be out there, to be saying, I'm a Democrat and I believe in capitalism. I believe in economic opportunity. I believe in hard work. I believe that people should have an opportunity to earn a good life, whether or not they have a college degree. There are so many of us who believe those things. And if we say them more loudly, I think it will balance out, not drown out, but balance out some of the folks that are further to the left.
Yeah.
The other thing that I find very frustrating is there seems to be a common wisdom in kind of the consultant class around DC and campaigns that we should not counter attacks on issues where we're vulnerable, that we should change the subject. And, a good example of this is there were a lot of people talking about Tom Suozzi's race right before the special election in February, who were saying he's wrong to talk about immigration. Immigration is his opponent's turf. That is a Republican issue, and he should change the topic to something people like about Democrats, like prescription drug pricing. That is a mistake, because if voters care about that thing, you can't just change the subject to something else. Yeah. It doesn't address their concern. And I think we need to not be afraid to talk about some of those issues. Sure, do we want to move the conversation back to where we're on offense? Absolutely. But unless voters trust that we can at least get to parity, that they can at least trust us to be okay on some of these issues they care so much about, they're not going to listen to us on anything else. And if all they're hearing is this attack ad, they again get this caricature of what we believe that is just not true. I mean, how many of your New Deal leaders support open borders? voters?
None. I can say none.
Right?
Zero.
So that's not a thing.
Yeah.
But
No,
that
it's
is
not
a
a
thing in
thing.
the attack ads. And if we can be out there saying, yeah, we are a nation of laws and a nation of immigrants. And
That's
we
right.
cannot be either of those things unless we are both of those things. And it is better for this country and it is better for migrants if we have a system that works, that we can work through the laws to allow people in who have legitimate asylum claims. And if folks do not have a legal right to be in this country, to send them home in a humane way. Like, we have to be able to say that out loud. That's what the vast majority of Americans agree with. And it's what the vast majority of us think as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you on that. I mean, I wonder, we're talking about kind of speaking more loudly, which I agree with. And really, which is just to amplify, again, what we're talking about, which is where a lot of the party is, right? Is to kind of push back on that caricature, which is not even true of where the party is. But I do also wonder, and your poll again may not address this, but there's also the how, not the what we say, but how we say it in a couple ways. One being just the how people are getting their information now. I feel like we were also not talking to people where they were. I mean, so not only were we not talking about what they wanted to talk about, we weren't actually talking where they were getting the news to some extent. Are you seeing that at all too?
Absolutely. And I think there's a huge problem with the asymmetry of online communication, whether that's the social groups that are, that are created around a non-political topic that then politics is being injected into it, or whether that's the podcast world. And frankly, as I've seen many times before, and I'm sure you have too, the Republicans beat us to those things. And then they built an infrastructure to support their influencers. And, the influencers that do exist on the center left are doing it with a shoestring, in their after hours.
Yeah.
And on the other side, they've got people being paid millions of dollars a year to do that same work. So I think absolutely we need to think critically about how we communicate. That, to me, particularly came across with young voters. We have a huge problem with young voters. And it's not just because they don't remember the last Trump administration. It's because we have a caricature of who they are. We believe they are all, elite college campus protesters. And that is just not the case. The Harvard Institute of Politics poll showed that 18 to 35-year-olds are the most moderate of any of the age groups.
Right.
And we really have to start questioning our assumptions about what young voters care about and want. We, saw in both our polling over the summer and in the Harvard polling, which is seen as kind of the really gold standard on young voters that they do every single year, that, student loan forgiveness was literally the last on the list in terms of priority, that the economy, cost of living, and immigration were at the top of the list, and climate and loan forgiveness were at the bottom. Yeah. And so really asking ourselves, what are we assuming about these different groups of voters, whether it's young voters or Black voters or Latino voters? Are we assuming Latino voters primarily care about immigration? Because we would be wrong.
That's right. They care about housing and affordability just the same way, right?
Yeah. That's right. And the thing that I found perhaps most shocking in the poll was that Latino voters trusted Trump more on border security than on any other issue we tested.
It's so interesting. Yeah.
And
and to your point,
that's
also,
not what we assume.
That's not what we assume. And it's also the way we think about, like, that Latino voters are somehow this monolith, right? Like, if you are a new immigrant of any sort, whether you're Latino or another type of immigrant, you have a different set of challenges than if you are a third generation Latino or another, that you are then, largely probably, focused on the same things about how cost of housing, cost of groceries, right? And so I think that the way you're saying it is a good way to say it, which is like, we're making assumptions about the electorate. And maybe to that point, another thing that I feel like is something we've just got to say out loud is that the way that we as Democrats tend to talk about the electorate is to slice and dice us into smaller demographic groups and then try to talk about that. And I know that I feel like that is a problem for us, because essentially if you look at that list and you don't find yourself on that list, particularly let's call it, young white men as a mother of a boy, right? Like, well, what, not that he said this, but where am I on this list? Right. And so I think I think we've got to get better at talking to everybody at once and not feeling like we're saying, hey, for you over here, we're going to do this. And for you over here, we're going to do this. And just really making the case that as Americans, we all want the same thing. We want good quality education. We want an economy that's working. We want to be able to afford, we want to, whatever, all those things. And I feel like we just don't do a great job at that.
Absolutely. And I've said in the past, in looking both at 2016, and I think it rings true for this election too, that it seems like Trump makes his case to the entire jury. And we make our case to each individual juror. We're like, juror number 1, I've got a thing for you. Juror number 2, I just created a new thing for you. Juror number 3, did you see my press release today about the thing I created for you? And it is not only a problem because it assumes that slice and dice group is a monolith, but exactly to your point, if you don't find yourself in one of the 12 jurors, then you're not part of the jury anymore.
Right. That's right.
So, and that's a huge problem. And I think we assume whose identity is going to be more important to who. And, maybe that's not the thing that folks primarily identify with. Maybe the thing they primarily identify with is being a Minnesotan. As a Minnesotan, I strongly think that many of us identify primarily as a Minnesotan before many other things. Maybe it's as a Catholic, maybe it's as a mother, maybe it's as someone who is thinking about the health of their children and wants to make sure that they get organic foods. And those kinds of things, those opted in kind of, not demographic, but social groups are the places that Republicans have really been able to infiltrate. I was talking to a young mother the weekend before the election. I was at a wedding and just chatting with a lovely woman who was like, I'm just trying to find recipes for healthy toddler foods I can make. And all of a sudden, RFK Jr. is everywhere because they have taken these influencers that think about organic foods for toddlers and injected the Make America Healthy Again piece into it. And I just think, we assume that we can tell you what identity is most important to you by looking at you. And Republicans are saying, I'm going to go based on what you've opted in to be interested in.
That's so interesting.
That's a thing that we're going to have to get better at.
Yeah. And it is a challenge for us because I feel like, not to belabor, but I mean, what we're really talking about is identity politics. And when people hear that word, that's what it means, right? Talking to people for this, what identity we assume they have or what is most important to them. But as the party of inclusivity, which is a good thing, a value that I think that all Democrats share, is that we want to make sure the economy is working for everyone, that everyone has access and barriers are brought down for everyone. So I think it is largely, it's a challenge for us who have that value so strongly, but also need to talk to everyone. Whereas, I think it's, I don't say it's easier, but I think it's just different if you're on the Republican side of things, frankly.
Absolutely, and we've always, frankly, had a harder coalition to manage. When you look at the fundamentals of the American electorate, there are more conservatives than there are liberals, which means that to win, Democrats have to win a supermajority of moderates. Kamala Harris won moderates, but not by enough. We need more because we do not have the same size of ideological basis they do. If you look over the last many elections in my lifetime, 80% of people who have voted for the Republicans have been self-described conservatives, but only 40% of those who have voted for Democrats have been self-described liberals. Another 40% are self-described moderates. Another 20% are self-described conservatives. So we have a more diverse coalition ideologically and in every other way. And so, if as they, can win by going more towards their base, we really can't do that. And I think we have to remember that essentially we live in a center-right country where our coalition needs to bring a big tent of people together. And, one of the things that we've done on our last few polls over the past few cycles is to ask this question, on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being completely liberal, 10 being completely conservative. Where do you put yourself? Where do you put the parties? Where do you put these nominees? And this time around, we asked this question, and people put themselves at a 5.63. So just to the tick to the right of center. 5 is dead set center, 5.63. They put Harris at 2.45, and they put Trump at 7.78.
Wow.
So both, about equal away from the middle. But that means that if you plot that on a line, voters' dot is about 1 point closer to Trump than it is to Harris.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we need to contend with.
That's
the difference.
Yeah.
And it explains why the other most baffling point in the poll that I didn't expect was that more people said that the Democratic Party was extreme than that the Republican Party was extreme.
Yeah.
It was only by a couple points, but the fact that we are even in the ballpark on that is insane.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're contending with is an electorate that we have to appeal to in values that go beyond just liberal left values, which we can do, but we have to try and recognize, and a stereotype of the Democratic Party that we're so far left that we just don't align with that.
Yeah. And can I just say it was something I know that we both agree with, but I think part of that too is we're not talking about changing our values, but we are talking about letting people in who don't agree with us on everything. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's really the challenge we have here. It's like, if people, say something that we don't agree with, we kind of roll our eyes and say, to your, I think this is why the extreme thing can come in, right? It's like, if you don't agree with us, you're somehow a racist, or this, or that, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, maybe I just actually disagree with you on this one thing, right? And so we have this. I think we've become this party of a little bit of a checklist, and if you don't check every box, you're not really welcome here. And I know that we don't feel that way, but I think that that's something we have to, as a party, understand that people can have legitimate questions, and these are hard conversations potentially, but that we've got to allow that dialogue, because we have to be, to your really great point about the numbers. I mean, we have to be a bigger tent. If we're just talking to people who agree with Democrats on every single issue, we can never win a national election.
That's right. Yeah. And I think, I really hearken back to the years of work I did around marriage equality on this point, because, people will tell you that we lost the 2004 election because of gay marriage, right? Mm-hmm. That was a long time ago. I was in law school. I'm not going to tell you whether or not I think that's true. I don't really know. But that was certainly part of the narrative. Mm-hmm. But that didn't mean that we then should throw gay people under the bus and say, we don't support your humanity anymore. That's right. Did mean that we had to understand the concerns that people had, and the questions, and the nuance, and the tension in values, and be responsive to it. And so we had to say, if we're going to pass a hate crimes bill, we're going to make sure that there are religious liberty protections so that your pastor or priest can speak their mind and preach the word without being in fear of going to jail, because people had that concern. We can protect people from hate crimes and also protect religious liberty. We can figure out how to persuade people to come along with us, to understand that what gay people wanted was to make a lifetime commitment in front of their friends and family, just like anyone else. And we persuaded them of that. And, when you look, a lot of people said, well, we'll just have to wait until there's generational change and younger people have a different view. 75% of the movement that we've seen on attitudes towards marriage equality has been people changing their viewpoint, not generational replacement. So it is possible for us to do that. But to do that, we have to make a distinction between the people who are professionally hateful that exist, that are there, that are in this country. We know that, that made being anti-gay their job, and the people who had legitimate concerns, questions, or wrestling, were had empathy, but also questions, and bring those folks along with us. And I've said oftentimes in the last couple of weeks to my staff here, especially the younger folks who don't really remember the details of the first Trump administration, there are people who voted for Donald Trump because of his racism and misogyny and hateful beliefs. And there are people who voted for him despite that. And we do not have to court the people in that first category. And we can take a moment before we really deeply try to understand the second category, because I know we all need a second to process. But that's a group we got to figure out, because
that's right.
There are a lot of people in there who could have been persuaded, who could be persuaded in the future, who voted for the New Deal leaders, who voted for Democrats down ballot, who agree with us on a lot of things. And I think they're gettable, and they have to be gettable, because that's really the only way that we can move forward and get this MAGA government out of our lives.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's a great place to end it. I mean, what, maybe as a last word, like, I feel for me, and by the way, I also feel this, had the same conversation with my staff. And I it's like I cried through through the first time I had to talk to them, because I just feel so bad that that they're so distressed, rightfully so. So anyway, that's a different conversation. But I would say that it feels to me like what is needed right now is a pretty big dose of humility and a pretty big dose of really listening and learning. And to your point, I think that's exactly right. This idea about, let's be curious. Let's not be mad. I mean, we can be scared. We can gear up. We know that there's going to be things that we're going to have to, resist against, and but there's also learning here, and we have to figure out how we are going to build this tent, make it a bigger tent with those people you're talking about. So what kind of advice do you have for everybody that's like, what do I do now, based on your poll, or just in general, the work that you do in this space?
Yeah, I mean, three things. Like, I love coming and talking to the New Deal leaders, because they know what's up. These are not folks who get their information on Twitter. They are folks who get their information from their constituents and people who have voted for them or not voted for them. And they just always give me a real grounding to what's happening in different places in the country, in communities. And so continuing to elevate, pragmatic, progressive, dynamic leaders who are resonating with a wider swath, and learning from them and hearing what they're hearing, I think is super, super important. On the kind of personal, where do you go from here side, the thing that got me through the last Trump administration and what I have now drawn on the whiteboard behind me, it's behind my head right now, a circle that says, this is my circle of concern. And then inside of that, there is a smaller circle, which is my circle of influence. And if you spend most of your time, this is from a management book called Good to Great, perseverating in the things you are concerned about but can't do anything about, your circle of influence shrinks. Mm-hmm. And if you do the opposite, you try your best every day to focus on the things you can influence, then your circle of influence grows. And I just have to believe that we have lots of overlapping circles of influence, and all of us are going to take a piece of this and figure it out, but wake up every day and try to figure out, where is mine and how can I do something that could actually have an impact, because there's a lot to do. And then third, just a piece of, where do we go forward? We have been looking a lot at international comparisons. Obviously, rise of right-wing populism is not just happening in America. The concerns about migration and inflation and post-COVID anxiety, a lot of these things are global that we're seeing and that are impacting our politics. And one of the things that we've seen is that the only way to defeat this kind of right-wing populism is through a robust center-left. Mm-hmm. And I truly believe that. It is not going to be trying to out-populist these folks on the far left. They're better at it than we are. They punch down and we won't. It wins in politics every time. But we can offer a center-left vision that can bring folks together. And I really think that's the only path to wresting government back. So that means our circle of influence is actually really big, because it is the thing that can help us get our country back moving forward. So I'm excited to keep working with you all and so many of our other allies to figure out exactly how to do that. We have a lot still to figure out, but I guess, we're the ones we've been waiting for.
Yeah, I love that. Well, Lanae, thank you so much for spending time with us today. Thanks for all the work you do. I am looking forward to staying in the trenches with you through all of this, and really appreciate your friendship and your partnership.
Same. Thanks so much for having me this week.
Okay, talk to you soon.
An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. Thanks to the team at NewDEAL for producing this episode. We encourage you to bring honor to public service, and because we keep things honorable, no tax dollars are used in the making of this podcast.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.